Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today, we'll be exploring the biological field. With me is Dr. Beverly Rubik, a biophysicist who has published over 100 scientific papers relating to the biological field, subtle energies, and psychic healing. Beverly is the founder and director and president of the Institute for Frontier Science in Oakland, California. Welcome, Beverly.
Thank you, Jeffrey. It's my pleasure.
It's a pleasure to be with you again after many years. You've devoted much of your career to looking at this elusive notion of the biological field. It's elusive because we tend to think of the human body in reductionistic terms and not in terms of field theory.
Absolutely. The conventional view is life is a bag of biomolecules, and it stops with the skin. And if we elucidate all of the parts according to conventional biology, then we'll understand the whole. But it's really not enough.
Yeah. For example, people think that all of the various organs and enzymes and thousands of components of a biological system are all programmed by DNA.
Yes, and it can't be so that DNA is really regulating and orchestrating millions of things reacting every moment. There's got to be something holistic, and that's the biofield.
Yeah. Now, can you define the biofield? It's sort of elusive, isn't it?
Well, the biofield is the organizing energy of life within and around the organism. And I believe it's also involved in biocommunication and bioregulation of everything, including the DNA.
Now, in earlier generations, there were notions such as vital energy. Is that what you're thinking of?
Well, we certainly considered that. But of course, science had a history with the notion of the life force. And around 1845, there was a death blow to vitalism in biology when someone synthesized a biochemical for the first time in the laboratory. So that was the death blow to vitalism. And yet we need a principle of this sort. We can't really explain the wholeness of life, its incredible coherence and reactivity instant. We can't explain energy healing. We can't explain how extremely subtle fields impact us without invoking a vital force.
And of course, ancient cultures all seem to have an idea of spirit or soul or pneuma or prana, ki or chi, their orgone energy. There's so many different ways in which people have tried to express this idea.
Absolutely. And not only ancient cultures, but most of the complementary and alternative modalities in medicine, from chiropractic to osteopathy, all of them hold the notion. All of them hold the notion of a life force, a vital field.
I mean, in homeopathy, for example, a remedy is diluted so finely that there may not be a single molecule left.
Absolutely. In homeopathy, we start with a mother liquor of some herb or chemical, and we dilute 1 to 10, and then there's succussion, and eventually we end up with no more molecules, but still there's a memory of water that conveys information, and it's a therapeutic remedy. And
you point out that the substance, even if there's not a molecule, there can still be a wave pattern.
Yes, and there was a famous experiment by Dr. Luc Montagnier, who is very well known because he's a Nobel Prize winner for co-discovering the HIV virus, which is associated with AIDS. So he explored DNA as a wave by taking first a sequence of DNA, say from a virus, and diluting it homeopathically, as we described, and then taking that very dilute, without any more DNA in it, completely contained and putting next to it a sealed test tube of water. And the whole thing was in a Faraday cage and exposed to a conventional carrier wave of 7 hertz, 7 waves per second. 24 hours later, he took that pure water and added the components of DNA and an enzyme, and presto, he could synthesize not just DNA, but the original sequence of the viral DNA.
The original sequence of viral DNA, which was communicated to a fresh test tube.
A fresh test tube of just water.
And the only thing that seems to have been communicated was the pattern.
The pattern of information, exactly.
So when we talk about biofields, we're talking about a field that contains information.
Yes, and we're talking about a field of energy that contains information. Dr. Fritz Popp called it electromagnetic bioinformation. I like that term.
But your research shows that even when you using Faraday cages, for example, you can pretty well eliminate any kind of electromagnetic signal, and you're still able to make measurements.
Yes, we are. We have discovered something truly novel in that there's obviously a component of the biofield that even the detectors that we build to look for chi or prana, this elusive life energy, shielded from all conventional electric, magnetic, and electromagnetic and acoustic and thermal energies. Something still is getting through to change the properties of our subtle energy detectors.
And as you described it to me earlier, that subtle energy detector, maybe as far as 10, 20 feet from your body, for example, is able to pick up on your emotional state, both positive and negative.
Yes, so not only are we picking up chi, what Qigong masters and energy healers can deliver with intent to heal, we discovered that we can pick up passion with focus, as well as downers, down emotions, fear, hate, anger, etc. So the needle moves in the opposite direction. So we have a way of monitoring the emotional field around a person or a group of persons with our new invention, which we call the emotional field detector.
And as we indicated earlier, it couldn't be an electromagnetic field.
No. If it is, then it's a component of the electromagnetic field that might have been discarded about 100 or more years ago, because there was Maxwell, the famous Maxwell equations.
That describe the electromagnetic spectrum.
Yes, developed in the 19th century, were once 20 equations, but then came engineer Heaviside, a British engineer, who simplified it down to 4 equations.
Heaviside, who was kind of heavy-handed.
Exactly. So he took and made it practical for engineers in a vectorial notation, mathematically. And that's actually what's taught to physicists as well as engineers today. So historically, that's what came down. And we had to go backward historically in science to take a look, what was Maxwell's theory all about? So there were things left out by the Heaviside formulation that is now taught as mainstream.
In other words, even with regard to conventional electromagnetic energy, there's a lot we still don't understand.
I think so. Even though we've known about electricity and magnetism for over 100 years, we've, I would say, developed a certain aspect into conventional circuits, but there are other ways to use electricity and magnetism that I know Nikola Tesla explored. And his work was also shut down historically.
So we're in a situation today where so much of our understanding of science and of nature is based on what we've been able to accomplish technologically, which means that we've probably left a lot out.
That's largely the case. And we tend to see things in terms of our technological developments. You know, it's interesting to think that centuries ago they thought about the brain-mind like a book. And then with the invention of the computer, that's become the model. And even the hologram, which is maybe a step further.
And Freud referred to the brain-mind system, and I think Jung may have also, as sort of a hydraulic system, like a steam engine.
Seems hilarious today.
Well, And no doubt in the future there will be other metaphors.
Right.
Because it seems as if this is an example of how we take whatever is the current technology, and that becomes the metaphor for nature.
Yes, very much so. Ditto for the sun. Many decades ago, the sun was considered electric. Then, after the discovery of nuclear energy, suddenly the sun was thought to be and taught to be a nuclear inferno. And we don't really know if the sun is a nuclear inferno. It's a model.
Yeah. And so it is with the human being and with every other creature, including plants. Now, one of the areas that you've looked at is the idea that all organisms emit photons.
Yes, the so-called biophoton, the ultra-weak light of life. And this is thought by mainstream science to be nothing more than chemiluminescence due to free radical reactions and therefore not important. They recognize that it exists, but they don't focus on it, whereas I have taken a look at biophotons with respect to different psychoenergetic states of subjects in research. And we can see that people can move into a new state of consciousness and try to make light, for example, from this region, which is called the third eye, or the ajna center, or from the heart in the case of sending energy as a healer, sending love. And we see somewhere between 100 and 400% more light coming from these areas of the body when other areas of the body, such as the hands, remain the same.
Now you call it ultra weak.
Yes.
Light. And so it's not normally visible, I suppose.
Well, actually, the eye, if we dark adapted our eyes, we could see a single photon, but you'd have to sit in a dark closet for about 5 hours.
That's amazing.
So we don't do that. But we have detectors that count photons called photomultiplier tubes.
Yeah.
And yes, indeed, the light coming from the human body is something that we need to count the photons on the order of, say, 20 to 100 photons per second per square centimeter.
Well, the very notion that the human nervous system, the retina, is capable of detecting a single photon, even if you have to sit in a dark room for 5 hours to make it happen, suggests that these ultra-weak sources of photon emissions could play a real role in some form of biocommunication between cells or organs of the body or between different organisms?
Yes, that is certainly so. And one interesting thing about human emission is that the face and the hands are the greatest emitters. Isn't that what we look at when we communicate, after all? So, but it's known for the animal kingdom that, for example, water fleas, Daphnia, in water suspension, seem to maintain distance based on the biophoton emission. So it has a distinct form of communication in biology. So we only surmise that it's so for humans, but it may be at an unconscious level.
Well, we seem to have the idea that bigger is better, that a signal has to be strong before we pay attention to it. A weak signal becomes trivial, not important. But what you're suggesting is that these subtle, weak signals may be very important in biological processes.
Absolutely. The biofield is a very weak field, although it's dynamic and complex and always changing. And the human body can respond to exquisitely small electromagnetic fields, really smaller than the thermal noise from molecular vibration. And that boggles the mind, really. We're talking about really the information conveyed by those signals that somehow we're able to decode through our biofield as the first receptor of these energies. And in general, I would say the soft, subtle side of nature has been overlooked. I've called it the feminine face of nature, that we've looked and given voice to the large forces of nature. But when it comes to the subtle aspects, we seem to have ignored that. And I sometimes wonder about that in terms of the gender imbalance in science as well.
Interesting, yeah. And also, in addition to photon emission, there's the acoustic aspect of the biological field.
Yes, indeed. And, the heart goes blub, 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 blub. It's the first sound of life. We experience this as fetuses in our mother's womb, and it's a very soothing sound. And, of course, our whole body, every cell is hearing this, even though without ears, but it's acoustically receiving the information, of course, conveyed through the water matrix of life.
At a vibrational level.
That's right.
It might even be tactile or...
Yes, it's more tactile, exactly.
So we have all these sensitivities that not only are they generally ignored by mainstream science, but they may play an enormously important role in such things as the development of an embryo.
Certainly. Embryos amazingly develop from a single cell divide, make a sphere of cells which becomes hollow, and then the hollow sphere invaginates. And fields must be shaping the development of this. In fact, the 19th century embryologists called it a morphogenetic field, although they didn't know at the time that it was electromagnetic.
Well, morphogenetic field is a term, if I recall correctly, used recently by the biologist Rupert Sheldrake to describe uncanny forms of communication amongst biological organisms. The 100th monkey example comes to mind, where monkeys on one island in Japan learned a certain skill. I think it was cracking open coconuts by banging them on a rock or something. And then in a distant island, miles and miles away, the same species of monkey began doing the same behavior. And Sheldrake said that was a morphogenetic field phenomena.
Yes, Sheldrake sort of borrowed the term from embryology, but extended it in a new direction.
So there are pioneer scientists who are looking at this.
There are a handful. It's really a minority of people looking at biofield phenomena in nature. But it's certainly important to try to explain how it is that energy healers or psychic healers can influence us, that there are emanations coming from the human body that apparently go beyond conventional energy and not just affect humans, but I did studies showing effects on bacterial cultures, which certainly document that it's beyond the notion of a placebo. Anybody could say, well, that's just because you think you're getting something. Somebody's waving their hands around you. And, the biology of belief. But when it happens at the level of the cell culture, that heat shock cell cultures that were damaged recover better from energy healing, from Reiki masters putting hands around cultures. And then I follow up counting cell numbers of viable cells in standard plate count assays. These studies were funded by the National Institutes of Health 20 years ago. And yes, indeed, we found positive results.
And at this point in time, I should think there are probably 100 studies or so showing the positive impact of a variety of healing modalities, including distant healing.
Actually, I would up that number to probably several hundred by now. And yet, the mainstream is recalcitrant to change. Part of the reason is we can't publish these studies in mainstream journals. There's a dogma in science, and this is unfortunate, but I would say it's typical of humanity to get locked into its worldview, and one's fame and fortune was built on a certain worldview. It's very difficult to change these people's minds. And as Max Planck said, science advances funeral by funeral. So we wait for the new generation to come in.
On the other hand, in the old Soviet Union, as I recall, back in the 1960s even, they were also looking at psychic healers and telepathy and clairvoyance, and they developed, using their materialistic science, the notion of bioenergetics as a way to explain these things, and I believe quite a lot of research was done there.
Yes, I look toward Eastern Europe and Russia for a lot of excellent research on subtle energies, torsion fields, as they're called today in physics, the scalar waves, energy healing, psychic healing. And yes, indeed, they did see this as not an aspect of spirituality, that they saw it as an extension of their materialistic worldview in science. But somehow, in the West, this got mixed up with science and religion, and that's a bad combination. So that's often an excuse. The mainstream does not want to look there. It's forbidden.
But you yourself, I gather, are open to seeing the biofield in a spiritual context.
Well, I think it's really important that if we're going to understand life fully, that we need to go as far as we can with science to explore the soul. And I see the biofield as really having one foot in the metaphysical realm and one foot in the physical realm. It may be as close as we can go toward that exploration, at least in my lifetime.
I know the ancient Vedanta philosophy talked about sheaths in which various levels of subtlety were enclosed. For example, you get the material physical body, but then you have the etheric body, and then you have maybe the mental body, and then you have the Buddha body, and so on, increasing levels of subtlety, I think they would say, of matter.
I think that's so, and I think that we are detecting part of that emotional body, the emotional soma, and especially as it extends outward from the human body.
Using your detector.
Using our novel subtle energy detector.
Yeah,
exactly.
And psychics, of course, as well as mystics of many varieties, have reported seeing auras or energy fields around humans and other animals.
And part of the biofield is not only within the body, but extending outward. Although the word aura is so popular and would really discredit scientists to use it. So we developed that word biofield just to avoid that lingo.
Well, and I've always suspected personally that the aura is an example of synesthesia, because every psychic I know sees it differently. It's not as if they're seeing the same thing, but I believe what they're doing is picking up information intuitively, maybe clairvoyantly. It gets displayed in what we could call the sensorium of the mind as a visual image. Just the way synesthesia works, where people can see music, for example.
Right. I think it's certainly true. And when you speak to clairvoyants, they all have their own method, their own synesthesia, their own way of relating to these phenomena. So it's interesting.
And it gets very complex when you add the synesthesia dimension to it, because there may well be a biological field. In fact, you're quite certain there is around everyone.
Well, and that's why we've been developing instrumentation as well as utilizing off-the-shelf commercial instrumentation to try to measure it. But we really need a human energy project. We had a human genome project, which was funded billions of dollars and leadership from major governments around the world, and that led to the rather enlightened fact that we have less genes than a grain of rice. Isn't
that fascinating?
It's amazing. I mean, certainly we have more complexity than rice. So what happened? Well, we have a lot of so-called junk DNA. That's DNA that we don't really understand what it does, but I think it's really regulating the other genes. But it really shows that epigenetics, the control of those genes, is key. And that's where the biofield comes in. I do believe that the energy field of the body is helping regulate which genes are turned on and turned off.
Interesting.
And I also believe that the mind is the ultimate regulator, or the conductor of the symphony of the energy field of life. And this goes back to Oriental philosophy, where mind goes, chi flows, and blood follows chi. So mind is primary, consciousness is primary. The biofield is a bridge between the mind and the flesh. And so we have a lot of effects of consciousness on the body. This is mind-body medicine. we need to explore that biofield, and we need a human energy project, just like we had that Human Genome Project. I've been advocating this for decades, and I do hope it happens.
Well, you were instrumental in getting the National Institutes of Health to recognize the concept of the biofield officially.
I was. I worked with a team at NIH in the early 90s. We needed a term. We looked at chi, prana, ki, et cetera, and we said we can't take an ethnic-laden term. We need a new word. So we coined biofield, and then we worked hard to make it a medical subject heading at the National Library of Medicine. That was important then because we didn't have all these great search engines on the internet as we have today, like Scholar Google.
Yeah.
So yes, indeed, it's a medical search term in PubMed, pubmed.com.
So at least that's the first step.
Yes, it is.
And I know long before the Genome Project, it took decades to launch the Genome Project. And during that whole preliminary period, people understood genes are very, very important. So I can be optimistic to think someday there will be a human biofield project because it's complex and important.
I think the human biofield is the most complex, dynamical field that we know of. More complicated than any other organism, for sure. It's always changing instant to instant as we shift and as our minds are shifting. So it would be a very worthwhile activity. We would really fully understand what it means to be human at another level if we could extend science.
And it would be a key to solving the so-called hard problem of consciousness, which is why are we physical creatures made out of matter conscious at all?
It's part of it, absolutely. But what is the essence of consciousness is yet another question, I think. And that's a really tough question.
It's a big mystery, and of course, as a parapsychologist, I get into the more exotic elements of consciousness, like how can consciousness influence distant systems, and there the biofield may be another very creative solution.
Yes, and I know parapsychology threw out the notion of fields playing a role, and they went to the quantum and they said it must be some quantum entanglement, Bell's theorem and things. But frankly, I think it may well be that not all the fields of life diminish over distance according to the inverse R-squared law.
Right.
So that really, it's possible that certain longitudinal waves do not lose their content
Laser
over distance.
beams don't.
Well, laser beams, they lose something, but in any case, there is the concept of longitudinal waves, which was in original Maxwell equations that was diminished and disregarded now for over 100 years, may save the day. It may actually be a modality that could convey some of the distant effects that we see in psi research and distant healing.
I see. And I think, to be fair, Beverly, parapsychologists didn't really discard the notion of biofields because there's only a handful of parapsychologists in any case who they all have their personal preferences, and if you begin to talk to them, you find there are many disagreements.
Well, that's for sure. There's no unified way of thinking in these frontier areas.
Which is both a liability and a plus.
I think it's great, actually, and it's definitely missing from conventional science, where things have gotten so gelled or concretized, not just gelled, concretized into dogma. Yeah. And then we lose a lot because the minute you discover an anomaly that challenges the dogma, you're rejected and ostracized, and you can't publish easily, even if you were a tenured professor. And there are several of these whom I know, and it's just terrible to see how the mainstream can drag its feet in really examining evidence.
Now, you mentioned instrumentation, and you've also talked about the device that you've developed in your laboratory for measuring subtle energies. I know you also work with the most recent iteration of the Kirlian photography devices that are being manufactured in Russia today.
Yes, indeed. And of course, this came out of, it was 1948 when Dr. Curlian invented this, but of course it was done with film for many years. And just as regular photography went digital, so did high voltage electrophotography, which means that you send a charge of 5,000 volts or so to the fingertips, and then we examine the corona discharge of the induced light emission from each fingertip, which we then analyze, and we can say things about the status of health and wellness.
And well, one of the things that I gather from this work is that it's similar to such fields as people who work with the iris, people who work with the ear, people who work with acupuncture, that the body functions almost holographically so that the fingertips map out all the other functions of the body.
That's an interesting thing. Yes, the ear and the hand are considered homunculus is the word, a dwarfed representation of the whole. And there's, in Korean hand therapy, which is a form of an acupuncture system, this is the head, these are the arms, and these are the legs. Think of a little critter. And so this image would relate to the head. So that's part of the software analysis. But the Russians have a very large database of many people they've studied, healthy as well as ill, and they've mapped where certain disorders show up, etc. It's really quite amazing, the software that goes with these devices.
So you're able to measure the corona discharge around the fingertips of people before and after meditation, before and after healing, and before and after relaxation processes. You see a real difference.
We do, especially in beginners, people who are not well energy regulated because they don't have a spiritual practice or a mind-body practice, because they look disheveled in the energy field, you know. There's sometimes gaps, missing parts, there's left-right imbalances, but after doing maybe one meditation, one yoga class, presto, the biofield really improves. And yet we don't see that on the long-term meditators or yogis because they're already in the zone. They're well-regulated, and one more yoga class or meditation time does not impact them as much.
So there are people, intuitives, who are able to do intuitive medical diagnosis, for example. I imagine they're picking up on this field.
Yes, indeed. And I once compared an intuitive to what I could measure with the biofield, and there was some correspondence. I was very gratified by that. But speaking of medical intuitives, we studied a medical intuitive for her own biofield in the biophoton chamber, and we could measure this area. This is called the ajna center, also known as the third eye. It's one of the key energy centers in the biofield. The
biophoton chamber is something you and your partner developed in your laboratory.
Yes, because we wanted to not only study single persons, but people interacting, such as energy healers and patients. But just in this one case, which was so fascinating, because in her normal resting ordinary state, the photon count was about what most people get, about 20 photons per second per square centimeter here. But in her intuitive the third eye open state, it was twice as large, between 70% and 100% as large in multiple trials, whereas the other emissions from her hands or her heart area did not shift. But this was her deliberate opening and closing of the third eye.
Very interesting.
So there's definitely a shift with a change in consciousness in the biofield. So we're really validating ancient Oriental concepts that where the mind goes, the energy flows.
Well, you mentioned the term the third eye, which is also known as the Ajna chakra. For people who are familiar with the chakra system, it's not only about a biofield, it's about subtle organs in the body associated in some people's minds with acupuncture meridians and with different emotional centers of the body. And I gather you find that there's, using your measurements, a lot of validity to these detailed ancient concepts.
Yes, indeed. We also found no matter if you're right-handed or left-handed, the right palm emits more light than the left hand, which is again consistent with Oriental theory that the left hand is yin, the right hand is yang. And yin is more receptive, the feminine archetype, and the masculine archetype is more exerting energy. And I've also measured that from energy healers in particular, that the right hand is always a stronger emitter.
So this concept of the biofield enables you to comfortably, as a biophysicist, work with healers.
Yes, we've studied a number of healers, as well as Qigong masters and other people with extraordinary abilities and who've refined their abilities over many years. And then we've worked with them, for example, in the Biophoton chamber, patients and energy healers together in healing sessions. I can say that no two healing sessions are alike. In terms of bursts of light that occurred during the energy healing, they were all unique. And that was another gratifying thing. And it fits with life. You go to a practitioner, your experiences are very different, day to day, person to person. It doesn't surprise me. It's the essence of being human. It's how we relate.
Well, and also when we talk about the biological field, it's not just humans, it's the whole ecosystem. All the plants and all the animals are communicating with each other at this energetic level.
I think so. Yes, and we even did some studies on agriculture to try to compare different methods of composting with animal manure and without manure, and then the commercial vegetables in the supermarket that may be GMOs or at least conventional agriculture. And we found differences in the light emission.
In measuring the biophotons.
Measuring biophotons, which is a kind of biofield from vegetables.
Interesting. Well, to me, one of the unique aspects of a field as opposed to an organism has a boundary, a membrane, a skin, for example, but a field does not. The field extends infinitely, does it not?
Yes, it does. It has no boundaries, whereas biomolecules in the skin is a definite boundary, and in the chemical view of life, in the biophysical view of life, we are like stars radiating throughout the universe. There's no limit.
So it's really a completely different way of understanding ourselves, understanding what it means to be a human being.
Yes, indeed. And I also see it as complementary too, and I'm not discarding the particle view of life. You know, in physics, we have a great principle called complementarity. On the one hand, even light behaves like a particle. We call it a photon.
Right.
And on the other hand, it behaves like a wave. And the same is true of us. It's true of all levels of nature. Where there's a particle, there's a complementary view of it as a wave. And it just depends on your measuring instruments, which one you're going to detect.
Well, I suppose it's fair to say that in popular culture, the term vibration, the idea that we can think of the way we vibrate, it's been around in popular music and popular ways of expressing. I think people intuitively understand it.
I think people intuitively understand. And actually, our receptors, they're actually antenna for the biofields of others. So we know, you don't have to look at someone. You walk in the room and you know energetically, you know, if someone's angry or someone's in a loving state, the facial recognition may add something, but there's already a sensing going on at a subconscious level.
Well, we could talk about this forever. We haven't even brought up, for example, Franz Anton Mesmer and his notion of animal magnetism. I know there are many, many other examples. Wilhelm Reich and orgone energy is another recent one. But I think we've pretty well covered your work in this area now. Well, Dr. Beverly Rubik, what a pleasure to be with you and to share your passion for this important and neglected area of science.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey. It's my pleasure.
Thank you, and thank you for being with us.